Well, as Ian said, our next session looks at the social impact of that decision-making with our keynote speaker, Sharan Burrow. From climate change to income inequality, what is the role of companies and investors in ensuring that there is a better outcome for everybody? Sharan is the General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation. She was re-elected for a third term as General Secretary in December last year, and of course before that she was President of the ACTU here in Australia. Now Louise Davidson, who needs no introduction to you, of course, as a CEO of ACSI, will moderate this session, and she'll join Sharan up on the stage at the end of her address. But right now, please welcome Sharan Burrow.
Thank you, and it's a delight to be back with you, although pretty scary time in Australia's history to watch the debates going on in this country, so just go vote on May 18. So, you know, my message is the world must change. For all the reasons Ian outlined, and many more, it must change. Reputational risk is well understood by CEOs and investors, even if it's too often ignored until there's a scandal. But failing to understand and address social and environmental risk goes well beyond the potential damage to the reputation or the share price of a company or an investment house. Decades of such behaviour is now undermining global economic security. An apology for failure won't fix systemic social and environmental risk. We need to change the rules of the global economy. You can choose many lenses to analyse the impact of pursuing maximum returns at any cost based on the narrowest definition of fiduciary responsibility, but ultimately the impact of such behaviour is proving to undermine long-term sustainability with human, environmental and indeed investment costs that simply can't be justified. Inequality is one such lens. Inequality is now recognised by all the major institutions, even the IMF and the World Bank, as a global risk. Yet the model of globalisation the world has pursued is itself a model of inequality by design. The global workforce is around 3 billion people. However, up to 60% of them are working in the shadows, the informal sectors of our economies. It's a sector of desperation, no rights, no minimum wages, no social protection, no rule of law. And yet major companies we all invest in will tell us they don't have any idea about this. That's just nonsense. Women and young people dominate this sector in large numbers, and new business models emerging with the use of digital platforms is also growing the informal economy. Modern slavery is still growing in 2019 with more than 30 million workers trapped in unacceptable conditions. Both informal work and modern slavery are increasingly found in the supply chains of multinational companies, which were already a dehumanising environment with low-paid, insecure and unsafe work, and is deteriorating. As someone who walks the global supply chains, I could tell you stories all day that if you thought our money was going into that environment, as human beings, you would be appalled. As human beings, you would be appalled. So I want to say to you, though, please don't think that's over there, such as the migrant workers in construction or domestic work in the Gulf countries, one of my passions, it is there, or enslavement in the fishing industry in Thailand, another passion for our sector. But right here on Australian strawberry farms, Fijian women are exploited, likewise Pacific Islanders, Asian workers in construction and other industries. The entire supply chain of Australian supermarkets needs to be cleaned up. You just ask the Modern Slavery Commissioner in New South Wales. Investments at home and across entire international investment portfolios are implicated in violations of fundamental rights, even slavery. In 2019, we are privileged to be actually celebrating 100 years since the International Labour Organisation was founded. And that was an amazing act. Out of the devastation of World War I, parties decided there would be a tripartite governance of global standards for working people around the world. And they laid out the demands for a floor of global rights and standards that was about the dignity of decent work. Yet this continues to be undermined by an economic model that has been founded on labour arbitrage in the endless quest for profit. So it's no accident that we have historic levels of inequality. The undermining of fundamental rights and job security, the absence of minimum living wages to the point where 84% of the world's people tell us that the minimum wage is not enough to live on, and the decline in collective bargaining for a more equal share of prosperity. These have all resulted in a global slump in labour income share, which is threatening demand. Demand is stagnant globally. And when you combine this with the failure to ensure universal social protection, the growing popular mistrust and anger is understandable. We are in an age of anger. People's despair is driving them to actually be angry about the world. And they don't trust anybody, even our democracies themselves in too many countries. More people, I can tell you, will go to bed hungry tonight than global leaders will tell you they've lifted out of poverty, and yet the world's 3 times richer in the last 20 years than it ever was. This is a model that's led to historic levels of inequality and quite simply the stagnation, as I said, of global growth. Few acknowledge the reality that if we don't heal the fractures of today's workforce that have been caused by the current model of greed, we will see even greater inequality in years to come. The consequent threat to economic and social prosperity can only increase the breakdown in support globalisation has that we depend on for investment returns, can only deepen the age of anger and continue to undermine our investments. In addition to these challenges and the consequent vulnerability of the global economy, the potential to add to this vastly more unequal world is emerging with waves of new technology. While technology offers huge potential economic, social and environmental opportunities, there are deficits, major deficits in the regulatory environment for ensuring decent work across internet-mediated platforms, for example, the integrity of algorithms. We're actually building in the biases of sexual discrimination or gender-based discrimination and race-based discrimination and so on. Privacy or the rights of the real asset owners to data. Who owns the data? What's your rights as asset owners of data? What's the nation's rights when you've got companies like Amazon mining the data like the traditional mining sectors, paying no value back to the owners of that data and acting as monopoly powers that are actually undermining both economic and social futures. And there is scant investment in new jobs to mitigate the displacement of workers in the face of the future production, despite the fact that most of our central banks, certainly ours, have a mandate to manage the economy, one of the lenses being in the interests of full employment. For those reasons and more, we argue it's time to change the rules. In fact, we've got people behind us. Ian actually talked about the expectations of the community. 95%, think about that. 95% of people tell us they want the rules of the global economy changed. And then if you look at climate, it's another lens. Hothouse Earth, an extinction crisis, not an existential crisis, an extinction crisis for humanity. Without urgent action, this is what awaits us. Despite the climate sceptics in Australia's federal parliament and the low ambitions of too many governments around the world, the science is in. In 2018 will be remembered as the year that climate warming hit the Northern Hemisphere. While workers and their families in Africa and Asia, indeed right here in Australia, have in fact seen the devastation of droughts and cyclones and floods, and extreme weather events, fires of course, this is brought home last year to many Europeans. The Swedish were so shocked. They'd never seen anything like this, fires rampaging through their forests. Temperature records have been set in Taiwan, Europe and the US. Heat strokes have killed many people in Japan, South Korea, Greece and elsewhere. Workers in construction, agriculture and transport sectors in particular have suffered, even died under these circumstances. And in some parts of the world, insurance is unaffordable. It's unaffordable for working people. Scientists are again raising the alarm though. A domino-like cascade of melting ice, warming seas, shifting currents and dying forests could tilt the Earth into a hothouse state beyond which human efforts to reduce emissions could be increasingly futile. The scientists also tell us we have a small window. It's not too late, but it's really a decade to stabilise the planet. And if we, and indeed, if we can do that and reduce emissions rapidly, then we need to take those opportunities. And they're not without the opportunities of investment and return. We also have to start taking adaptation measures seriously if we want people to be able to survive and to thrive. The IPCC report of 2018 demonstrated that the best security in fact lies in the 1.5 degree benchmark. And it said that it would take to achieve this, in essence, that decade to stabilise the planet. Every part of our economy must shift. Of course, we have to move beyond fossil fuels. That's painful, it's particularly painful for our communities, but we are the ones out there saying it must happen and that we want the kind of agreements that allow for a just transition. But if you just focus on fossil fuels, you have to, then we've still lost the game. You know, in heavy manufacturing, 35%, or industrialisation, 35% of emissions, and we can change all of that. We can get to net zero by 2050 or earlier, even in the aviation sector, but we have to do it together. And of course, a circular economy is now an imperative, as planetary boundaries and biodiversity risks will also impact on our lives, our jobs, our health, our pharmaceuticals, and indeed economies. So the future, I'm sad to say, is now. It's now. For unions, it's a reality. There are no jobs on a dead planet. We've been campaigning around this for a long time in the lead up to both Copenhagen and then to Paris. But I won't pretend to you that that's an easy thing to actually have the realities grasp at the grassroots level. But I'm proud of our movement because we have stood the ground. We are part of the people who are seen as climate leaders. And indeed, we campaigned for well over a decade to get the concept of just transition. A transition, yes, has to happen, but it must be just. Not like the shifts of previous years where workers became, you know, stranded families, stranded communities. So just transition is in the Paris Agreement, and it is part of that mix that I ask you to take seriously, and it's not that hard. We know that just transition guarantees, in fact, the trust that will get you to higher ambition. If you've negotiated with coal miners in Alberta or in Canada or in Germany or in some of the industrial workers in Scotland and so on, you know it's hard, it's really painful. But if we can achieve in Poland the presidency last year at COP, actually himself leading, taking our declaration, changing it a little, not so bad, and calling it a solidarity declaration for just transition, the Silesia Declaration, and actually getting over 50 heads of state to sign up. That's the urgency we need. Now we need them, of course, to implement it. So, but we know that when you talk to people, when they see hope, because it's all about hope, it's about the antidote to fear. When you actually see people with hope that they have jobs, they'll have secure incomes, that their families will have jobs, that their communities won't die, then in fact they know they need to shift for themselves and for their children. And it's achievable. It doesn't require all that much. It does require government leadership. It requires national development plans for the creation of sustainable jobs. That means workers, employers, governments working together. Industry policies back in fashion. Kind of makes me feel a bit old, but very happy that in fact it is. That we need secure pensions for older workers. Now in Australia you've built a pension system. But I can tell you in so many other countries, you know, that is not the case. And industries who are walking away are actually walking away with workers' pension funds. So guaranteeing secure pensions for older workers, skills and redeployment or employment guarantees for all workers. If we can do what the Nordic countries are doing with industrial agreements and government action, where you give income support, training support, retraining support and redevelopment support, the average time that workers are out of work is around 7 months. But they're not going to starve, they're going to have their income, their responsibilities to engage in the shift. And that's the kind of maturity that we need to get into all of our economies. We, of course, want universal social protection, including income protection for all people. Investment in quality jobs and sustainable communities. The communities are critical. They're really critical. If people just walk away from communities, and we've done agreements with companies like NL comes to mind, because I was talking about them yesterday in Italy. You know, the pain of seeing coal-fired power stations close in Australia, Hazelwood, Port Augusta, painful, long years of pain. 27 coal-fired power stations will be closed by NL in 7 years. They don't walk away from those sites. They actually provide for the workers. They redeploy them into renewables where they can, and where they can't, they help build other industry opportunities. That's the kind of company you need to invest in. Of course, we want reinforced rights for information and consultation for all workers. We used to have those tech change clauses where workers knew what was going on. When you actually engage people, you build trust and you get ideas, and of course it leads to agreements. So while workers, governments and employers have responsibility to make sure emissions are reduced, accompanied with short and long-term employment plans, so do investors. So with the principles for the PRI, of course led by our own wonderful Fiona, the Harvard University, the London School of Economics and the ITC, we released a Just Transition Guide in November last year, and I'm very grateful to see the Australian leadership. ACSI members, of course, including Australian Super, CBUS, First State, Vision Super, HESTA and IFM are all amongst the funds, at the moment worth about $8 trillion, that have signed up. Now we need to work with you to make that a reality. We now need to ensure an alignment with practice across the board, and it begins with responsible investment. Then there's tax avoidance and evasion. Well, to date, naked self-interest has been dressed up in all of these areas, in economic models, modern economic models, to justify why wealth is not being shared, why natural resources are being exploited unsustainably, why corporations and the wealthy pay little or no tax, and why there's a severe lack of resources for social protection and vital public services, including health, education, childcare and aged care. But we can rebuild democracy in this process in everybody's interest. Funds must engage with companies, and I was delighted to hear Ian talking about, I don't know why I'm calling you Owen, Ian talking about active ownership, Ian. And for workers, we need a new social contract and the compliance to ensure decent work. The world needs a new social contract. The International Labour Organisation will mark its 100 years conference this year, and it's well placed to address the challenges of inequality, insecurity and change. For justice in today's workplaces and for tomorrow's challenges, the basis of decent work ironically remain the same. Freedom of association, the right to associate freely, political parties, community groups, unions, minimum wages and collective bargaining rights, non-discrimination, freedom from forced and child labour, safe work and universal social protection, working time sovereignty and social dialogue. Simple, age-old recipes. The change to the way we do business, we need to look at how we put that floor under all workers. So we are arguing as part of this social contract, which has a lot of other things in it nationally and internationally, a universal labour guarantee. Very simple commitment to workers, informal workers, platform workers, direct employed workers, whatever, that they will all be guaranteed fundamental rights, OC health and safety, freedom of association and collective bargaining rights, and of course the capacity for some time sovereignty. I point out to employers all the time that while it doesn't work in quite the same way, Convention number 1, the first global rule, was in fact 8 hours work, 8 hours rest, 8 hours leisure, and so on. So we need to rethink these things, but the protection of people remains the same. So we can make this work. We can have a renewed commitment to full employment with investment in jobs beginning with infrastructure and care services. We also demand that all business have a social licence to operate. When they're registered, they should pay tax in the country where they earn business. That's accepted by the G20. but in fact we're still not seeing implementation. We equally expect governments to mandate due diligence for all businesses to mitigate violence of human and labour rights. And people say, well, due diligence is going to kill the economy. Guess what? You do financial risk. You now do environmental risk better than you did ever before. So this is not about sanctions, except for those bottom feeders who should be, in fact, punished for depraved working environments. But it is about saying, where's the risk? What are the grievance procedures? And how do we work together to actually effect remedy? That's the UN Business and Human Rights Guiding Principles. There will be, in fact, a UN treaty. It's in negotiation. It'll take a few years, but we need to get ahead of the game. So, as part of a new social contract more broadly, we need to work with companies, with you, with everybody on due diligence. We need it mandated by governments. We can wait for the treaty. We need it mandated by governments, and that's shifting. I won't go through them all, but there are emerging legislative environments. In France is the best example of the vigilance law. A little light on compliance, but it's a good start. We've got the EU moving towards a mandatory due diligence law, a draft bill in Germany. We've got the UK and the Australian modern slavery bills and so on. There's, of course, legislation in the US around trade and forced labour and etc. But beyond these front runners, we actually do have an emerging discussion about this with business. And that's where we want to be, because we also have a problem with the current trade model. Multilateralism's in deep trouble, deep trouble, because of the breakdown in trust. That's not good for your long-term security or our long-term security, but in fact, we need to go back and look at the Bretton Woods institution and undo some of the damage we did in the 90s, where environment, labour, finance and trade all walk on separate legs, because otherwise we won't actually rebuild trust or overcome the exploitative model that you've seen, where basically a machete's been taken to the social contract since about the 80s. You still hear people say, but trade's not responsible, or we can distribute the wealth afterwards, Sharon. And I say, yeah, that's what got us into trouble in the first place. So trade and investment are necessary for all economies, and they've generated massive growth. But it's a separation that is the problem. We actually need to be able to work across borders at all levels, and increasing our legislation can't be just at the national level, or if it's at the national level, it has to mandate for access to due diligence or requirements for due diligence across borders. And then, as I said, there's the threat of global monopolies. No country is using their competition powers to actually moderate companies like Amazon. None of them. There's a little bit of an attempt in India around monopoly of owning a platform and selling your own goods off it and so on. But that's about it. But the viability of Main Street is really at risk. And not only, I could tell you the abuses of workers' rights, it's appalling. You know, hundreds of ambulances called to UK Amazon sites. You know, workers actually on food stamps in the US because the richest man in the world pays his workers so much less. But it's much more than that. It is about what kind of business models do we want for the future, and does monopoly power, is it still the face that we had the too big to fail banks? We didn't do so well on some of those. We've got now these too big to touch companies. But one government alone is not going to tackle that. So you have to act globally, and we have to build new global architecture. In fact, I make the point that everyone was surprised that Mark Zuckerberg said, regulate us, then regulate us. Well, why wouldn't he? I mean, the risk to his business model is a loss of client trust. And that's rapidly breaking down because of the misuse of people's data, hate speech and so on. Indeed, it's vital and urgent to see a global agreement on the governance of data and privacy, both to build the trust and to avoid the dangers that comes with monopoly power. Without rules, big technology monopolies will continue to put both fair competition and people at risk, and as they consolidate their footprint. And of course, as for taxation, evasion and avoidance, well, it's indeed the big symbol of how to make wealth with no responsibility. And for investors, beyond the risk to people, domestic companies and the environment, you know, the profits that are dubious, you can't afford to take. You just can't afford to take them in a world that is changing both in terms of litigation. And I would hope, on a personal note, that you're all cautious about investing in the current Uber IPO. It's not making money. And the way it's treating workers, I have these conversations with the CEO, but you could fix that model. You could fix that model. So it's not about the technology. It is about the social licence to operate and the way people, and of course the profits that they make. So rights, environmental standards and good governance do not stand in the way of prosperity. They do not and they must not. With these standards and principles as the floor for fair competition, with due diligence enshrined in the operation of companies and investors, we can ensure inclusive growth. Together, we can change the rules and realise the promise of the Sustainable Development Goals, those big promises in 2015. Sustainable Development Goals, Paris Climate Agreement, a pathway to a zero carbon, zero poverty world. But we can only do it if we all work together and if we're all serious about creating a sustainability that guarantees us a living planet, and you can play a huge part in that. We've got a lot to be proud of. The unions, the employers, the people who manage our investments, but we can do better.
Thank you, Sharon. Sobering words. We have a little bit of time now for some questions, and we'll go to audience questions in a moment. We've got 3 roving mics around the room, so please get yourself ready. And if I could ask that when people ask a question, if they introduce themselves, that would be very helpful. I'm going to start, though. Thinking about the things that you've been talking to us about this morning, Sharon, I'm wondering whether you've got some ideas about the conversations that investors need to be having with companies now to move these agendas forward and to make sure that we don't end up on the wrong side of history.
Absolutely. I mean, you need to build the kind of partnerships that are in this room, but we need to have a more open and trusted dialogue about how to move the agenda so it becomes a normal operational part of our everyday thinking, decision making about investment. You know, I work with a group of CEOs. They're interesting friends, can I tell you? It's called the B Team, and Paul Polman, who just stepped down from the CEO of Unilever, is the chair and I'm the deputy chair. And, you know, I'm the kind of thorn in their side that keeps reminding them of, they know the world has to change, but it's painful. It's really painful to have to sit down and think, well, are my operations fit for purpose? How do I map supply chains that are sometimes 12 and 14 tiers? It can be done, and once you embed it, if you take the just transition principles, we worked with the B Team to take what's a fairly, you know, esoteric, high-level set of principles coming out of the Paris Agreement, negotiated at the ILO, and make them business principles. And now there are businesses testing those about how you mainstream. If you've got a commitment for the B Team, they have to make 3 commitments. Very tough entry ticket. You have to commit to zero carbon in all your operations by 2050, and Richard Branson's a member, so that's aviation, and you know that's a very interesting challenge. And I could tell you the stories we had about getting there, but now they're pulling it back even to 2030 because of the IPCC's report last year, and that's a huge challenge. The second principle is human rights, and that means, you know, being aware that you have to make sure your supply chains are not abusive, and what mechanisms do we have to clean it up. And that's where people like me come in. And the third area is anti-corruption, basically good governance. But they have been so strong about all of those areas. So, but the conversations we have are fascinating. You know, don't think you'd mind me telling you, I had dinner before I left Europe a couple of weeks ago with the CEO of Danone, French company, great company, really incredible human being at its helm. And he wanted to know whether or not I thought that it would make sense for him to engage unions to actually sign off on the supply chain assessment around due diligence with him. And I said, well, I think that's a great challenge on responsibility on both parties, but you'd have to have the remedies in place first to fix the issues before anyone could sign off on it, or otherwise both reputational risks. And he said, yes, so let's design that. Now, that's not going to be the case for everybody, but if you think about the CSR industry, it's a huge con. I'm sorry, but we all invested in it, $80 billion plus. And frankly, the issues for workers and their communities and their environment have got worse. So conversation.
Yeah. So are there examples of what investors are doing globally, perhaps in the UK or in Europe, that you think we ought to consider trying to bring into our models here?
Well, I think on the regulatory front, you raised a number of those in the trustee forums yesterday. Other countries aren't frightened to regulate. Australia has been, and probably we can make the case that actually just bringing into alignment with some of the regulation. But, you know, I can go to a lot of the European funds and say we have a problem, and you sit down and talk about it, and then they simply build it into their operating principles. And we have to get to that point where we have to agree, and that's not easy. And people will be anxious, but I don't know anyone that's actually not made money or couldn't make money from investing in companies that are about decency, about human rights and about environmental sustainability, because it is about it's not just the long-term sustainability of the investment or the company that you're investing in, it's about the fact that people are going to be there engaging in making that wealth so that it gets returned. So yes, there are, and we could give you some of those ideas, but I thought yesterday you painted a good picture. And ACSI, I read your, Louise forced me to read your latest policy prescription. No, I did it with great pleasure, and they're good. They're really good. They're thoughtful, and it's taking, I think, our industry forward. Australia's really respected internationally, and you know, my colleague Greg Combay is now heading up IFM, and what I've been saying to him is we need you to join forces. So we're, for example, linking Danish pension funds, because they've got a huge expertise in wind, with, you think America's totally anti-climate, it's not true. If you go state by state, where some of them are bigger economies than ours, if you go to New York, you've got the unions, the governor, the employers, they're all looking at renewables, and so the Danish pension funds will prop up the investment for huge offshore wind parks, for example. And we're doing similar things in California, a lot of that in Europe, some of it in Africa, not enough, although there's a great Nordic piece now from the heads of state in Norway, not in Norway, in the Nordic countries, where they're actually building sustainable regions themselves, but then twinning, like the old cities twinning, with regions in Africa, for example, and deploying the same technology and the same levels of investment. And that's what global solidarity is about. But it's not just about solidarity, it's about making the ambition work that we need by 2030.
Have we got questions in the audience? If you would like to ask a question, please just raise your hand. We've got one over here, Carol.
Thank you. Is that on? Carol Austin from State Super.
It's not on. The microphone's not working.
Carol Austin from State Super. Thank you, Sharon, for a terrific presentation. Could I raise the possibility of raising your sights even further?
Yeah.
What we're seeing for the first time is people, what you consider on the other side of the debate, raising similar questions to you. We're starting to see capitalists and very senior capitalists question the validity of the capitalist model. They're looking at Brexit, they're looking at what's happened to the fragmentation of politics in Europe. They're looking at the appointment of Donald Trump and saying, what's gone wrong? Why is the community so angry and unsatisfied with the model that we've got in place? And they're saying, what is fundamentally wrong with capitalism? And they're looking at the structure of businesses and saying, do we need to reinvigorate antitrust legislation? Have companies become too big? do we need to regulate in a different way? And they are putting a number of these propositions out. And what I want to suggest is that it's a great opportunity for people working at the grassroots on how you improve governance at the individual company level and thinking of the bigger picture. People like Ray Dalio, the head of Bridgewater, one of the largest hedge funds in the world, is saying we've done something fundamentally wrong. We have an opioid epidemic. We have extraordinary inequality. What have we done wrong? So it's an opportunity now to reach across the aisle and look at those that are saying, how do we do capitalism better so that we benefit workers, people in the supply chain, companies that are part of the distribution process. And this hasn't happened in the past, but now capitalists are saying, how do we do it better?
Well, I totally agree with that. They're worried. I mean, they're actually worried, and that's, I don't care what motivation it was, but they're seeing that their business model's not sustainable if they don't change. And so those conversations are critical, which is, I think, what Louise was asking. But can I also tell you, there's a bit of hypocrisy too, because those same corporate CEOs will employ lobbyists or through their associations. I have to say, you know, I'm not pretending unions are perfect. We're a microcosm of every other piece of society, but most of our business associations are not fit for purpose. You've actually got one hope with Paul Pullman and our own John Denton, who've just taken over as a partnership the ICC, the International Chamber of Commerce. But most big CEOs are walking away from them. And so the conversation is, in my view, with CEOs, until we get groups of them, like the B team and others, that are actually prepared to act together and to raise their voice. Because the dollars going into corporate lobbying against sensible regulation, against policy, against government intervention, are actually working against everybody's interests. But for most companies that are thoughtful, they can look down that track and they can say, well, our fair competition floor has been totally eroded. And then there's the other question we didn't even touch on today, but what happens to the current development model in manufacturing with 3D printing? And I'm telling some of the, you know, poorest countries, the Prime Minister in Ethiopia, for example, fine, pick up the low-paid textile jobs out of Asia, but bank on 10 years. Like, you might have 20, but bank on 10 years before 3D printing means you're actually not got those big factories. You go down and order your Levi jeans from, you know, the local store, and you want 4 stripes and 2 pockets and whatever, and they're printed out for you. There will be supply chains, but the thoughtfulness that you used to get from old structures like the Manufacturing Council here, so that's how old I am these days, where people work together about what was today and what was the future, they're few and far between. So you're absolutely right.
Other questions? There's one in the middle here.
Sharon, you brought up the big banks too big to fail being the interest of the investment community over the last 10 years for very good reason, but you touched on the fact that the platform technology companies are now becoming too big to touch. I mean, 6 of these companies now dominate the US stock exchange. 3 of them are the first trillion-dollar companies in the world. Despite, or perhaps because of, they successfully evade and avoid international taxation. They do really bad things in the value chain, certainly Apple in China, and their social responsibility is constantly in question. The fact is that these vast corporations have achieved an isolation and a position of power unique in our history. And it seems that to the extent that the investment community does influence them, it's the hedge funds and the activist funds who are just trying to strip money out of them. Where are the investors trying to make the platform technology companies more responsible, and what can we do? Could you say a little bit more on that?
Oh, look, there are lots of exciting tech startups, and in fact, one of our unions out of Sweden has made itself basically the place to go if you want to start a tech startup for all sorts of support reasons and so on. But you have the exciting community-based, I mean, many of them will become big companies, but at the moment they're operating within a national social licence to operate frame. These other companies aren't. And I asked the analysts, because I'm puzzled by it. There's a great journalist, if you don't follow her, Rana Furaha from the New York Times, Financial Times, sorry, and she's been writing about the FANGs for, 3 years or something. Really bold, thoughtful kind of discussion. But I asked some of the analysts once in the UK for precisely the reason that you just outlined, how come these companies are growing hand over fist? Why would someone invest in Amazon when the only part of it making money is its cloud computing business? And, it was on a television show, so they were, oh, Sharon, don't be so unfair, I said, no, it's not unfair. Why are people investing in a model that is not regulated largely, that you have no guarantees you'll be getting returns? Yes, you can speculate on the share price trading, etc. And they said, well, they're just so big that everybody thinks they are going to make money. And I said, well, that used to be gambling in my world, but it's true. And I understand governments are frightened to touch them alone, but that's why we need to rebuild multilateralism and the rules of the game. Doesn't mean there won't be areas that governments want to regulate about for their own national interests. But we say, for example, on the new e-commerce, these people are driving a demand for a new e-commerce trade agreement, although in the sense they don't need it. And we say that's fine, but e-commerce is a reality for sure. And you probably do need regulation in terms of a trade arrangement. But without those bigger areas of governance around data ownership, data privacy, are you really handing it over to the vested interests of, again, the major nations with the major corporate headquarters who want this in their own interest, and not thinking about what are the rules of the game in which you're operating a trading model? So, they are too big to touch. And these other companies we're talking about, I mean, Walmart's not my best friend, can I tell you? They're not bad on the environment, they're just shocking on workers' rights. But Walmart's scared of Amazon. Why? Because retail, Joe Brune's sitting here, the retail industry is saying, well, what's our future? And no one's talking about it except behind closed doors in a half hush-hush way. And the hedge funds are absolutely amongst the worst of them, because it is just about making speculative money while you can. So these are the things we need to demand, not just in the interests of what we think is fair competition and decent capitalism, that's one thing, but really in the interests of sustainable investment over the long term.
We're out of time, I'm afraid. It would have been great to have continued this discussion, but Sharon, I really want to thank you for travelling all the way from Brussels to share these thought-provoking global perspectives on some very profound issues with us. Thank you.
Thank you.